The clock read 12:23 a.m. on June 6, 1944. High above the dark coastline of Normandy, the engines of a transport aircraft roared through the cold night air. Inside the vibrating fuselage of a Douglas C-47 Skytran, young paratroopers sat shoulder to shoulder, gripping their gear in silence. Most of them were barely out of their teens. Each man carried nearly 80 pounds of equipment: parachutes, ammunition, explosives, and weapons that would decide the fate of the largest invasion in human history. Among them stood Joseph Beyrle, a 20-year-old sergeant from Michigan and a member of the legendary 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division. Tonight, they were jumping into occupied France as part of the most dangerous airborne operation ever attempted. Outside the aircraft, the sky suddenly erupted with flashes of orange. German anti-aircraft guns had found them. Tracers streaked upward like glowing claws reaching for the aircraft formation. One burst exploded dangerously close, shaking the transport violently. Inside the plane, no one spoke. They had trained for this moment for nearly 2 years. But training could never fully prepare a man for war. The pilot pushed the aircraft lower, trying to avoid the deadly flak that filled the sky above Normandy. But flying lower created another problem. The jump altitude was dropping fast. Standard airborne doctrine required a jump at about 1,200 feet. Below that height, a parachute might not have enough time to deploy. Joseph Beyrle stood near the open door, gripping the metal frame as wind screamed through the aircraft. His heart pounded in his chest as the coastline of France appeared beneath them, dark fields broken by hedgerows and narrow roads. Machine gun fire flashed from the ground. German defenders were waiting. The red jump light glowed above the door. The men checked their equipment one final time. Helmet straps tight. Reserve chute ready. Weapons secured. Joseph Beyrle carried a Thompson submachine gun, along with demolition charges intended for a specific target, a German electrical facility that powered defensive communications across the region. His mission was simple: land behind enemy lines. Destroy the power station. Disrupt German communications before the invasion beaches came alive at dawn. But nothing about this night was going according to plan. Another explosion rocked the aircraft. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage. Somewhere behind him a man shouted. The plane banked violently. The jumpmaster looked toward the cockpit. The green light never came. Instead, chaos erupted. The pilot shouted over the intercom that they were taking heavy fire and losing altitude. The aircraft was now barely 400 feet above the ground. Too low for a safe jump. Too dangerous to stay inside. Joseph Beyrle had seconds to decide. A burst of flak punched through the aircraft again. The jumpmaster turned and shouted a single command. Go! Beyrle stepped into the darkness. The rushing wind swallowed him instantly. For a split second there was nothing. No sound except the roar of air and the distant thunder of anti-aircraft guns. Then gravity took hold. He was falling. At that altitude his parachute had only a few seconds to open. For seconds. 3, 2. He pulled the cord. The chute exploded open above him just moments before he hit the ground. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. But he had survived the jump. Barely. Unfortunately, his landing location could not have been worse. Instead of farmland, he crashed directly through the roof of a church in the small Norman village of Saint-Comdemont. Wood splintered. Tiles shattered. His parachute tangled in the church roof before collapsing into the cemetery below. Gravestones surrounded him in the darkness. For a moment he lay still, stunned and trying to catch his breath. Gunfire echoed across the countryside. Explosions rolled across the horizon. The invasion had begun. But Beyrle quickly realized something else. He was completely alone. The aircraft formation had scattered under German fire. Paratroopers were dropping across miles of countryside, far from their intended landing zones. Entire units had been separated. Some men landed in swamps and drowned. Others dropped directly into German defensive positions. The night was chaos. Beyrle grabbed his Thompson and moved into the shadows. Somewhere nearby German patrols were already searching the fields. If they found him now, the mission would end before it began. He checked his equipment quickly. demolition charges, wire cutters, extra ammunition. Everything was still intact. The mission was still possible. Most soldiers in that situation would have hidden until daylight. They would have tried to regroup with friendly forces. But Joseph Beyrle did something different. He started moving deeper into enemy territory. Over the next 3 days, he became something close to a ghost in the Norman countryside. German patrols swept the hedgerows searching for paratroopers. Machine gun nests guarded the crossroads. Snipers watched from church towers. Yet somehow Beyrle kept slipping past them. Using his demolition training, he sabotaged German infrastructure piece by piece. He cut communication wires along rural roads. He destroyed electrical relays. And finally he reached his primary objective, the power station. Under cover of darkness, Beyrle placed explosive charges along the facility's main generators. Minutes later, a powerful explosion tore through the building. The station erupted in flames. For miles around, German communications suddenly went dark. The mission had succeeded. But surviving behind enemy lines was becoming harder by the hour. German forces were flooding the region as they responded to the invasion. Patrols increased. Roadblocks appeared. And the net around the scattered paratroopers slowly tightened. On June 9th, Beyrle's luck finally ran out. Moving through a hedgerow near the village of Corentin, he suddenly froze. 4 German soldiers stood directly ahead of him. Behind a sandbag position sat a heavy machine gun. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The Germans raised their rifles. Beyrle dropped his weapon. For the first time since jumping into Normandy, the war stopped moving. He had been captured. The soldiers searched him quickly, removing his weapons and equipment. Then they noticed something unusual. His name, Beyrle. It sounded German. His grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria decades earlier. To the German interrogators, that detail transformed him from a normal prisoner into something worse, a traitor to his heritage. During the interrogation that followed, they demanded information. Landing locations, Allied troop movements, the strength of the invasion force. Beyrle gave them only 3 things. His name, his rank, his serial number. Nothing more. What happened next would shape the next 7 months of his life. The Germans removed his dog tags. Those tags would later be given to a German infiltrator, a spy who planned to cross Allied lines disguised as an American soldier. Weeks later, that spy would be killed by American troops. When they searched the body, they found the dog tags. The name Joseph Beyrle. Soon afterward, the United States War Department officially listed him as killed in action during D-Day. A telegram arrived at his family home in Michigan. His parents believed their son was dead. A funeral mass was held. Friends and neighbors gathered to mourn him. But Joseph Beyrle was not dead. At that very moment, he was sitting in a German prison cell watching guards beat another American soldier unconscious. And his nightmare was only beginning. Within weeks, he would be transferred through a chain of prison camps across occupied Europe. Beaten, starved, interrogated, and pushed deeper into the German military prison system. Most prisoners who entered those camps never escaped. But Joseph Beyrle had already proven something important. He was not the kind of soldier who accepted captivity. He was already planning his first escape. The cell smelled of damp concrete and fear. Joseph Beyrle sat on a wooden bench inside a German interrogation facility somewhere in occupied France. The room was dim, lit only by a single hanging bulb that swung slightly whenever someone slammed the heavy steel door. Across the room, another American prisoner lay on the floor. 2 guards had just finished beating him with rifle butts. Beyrle watched silently. This was only the beginning. Within days, he was placed into a transport column with dozens of captured Allied soldiers. German guards marched them along dusty roads toward a railway station where trains waited to carry prisoners deeper into Nazi-controlled territory. For most prisoners of war, that journey meant one thing: years of captivity. But Joseph Beyrle had already decided something. He was not going to spend the rest of the war behind barbed wire. He was going to escape. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Somewhere along the road, the distant roar of aircraft suddenly echoed across the sky. Allied fighter bombers appeared overhead. Moments later, explosions ripped through the German convoy. Bombs slammed into the road. Guards scattered in panic. Dust and smoke filled the air. For a brief moment, the entire column dissolved into chaos. Beyrle ran. He sprinted across a nearby field as explosions thundered behind him. Bullets snapped past his head as German guards fired wildly into the smoke. But Beyrle kept running. He ran for hours. Through fields. Through forests. Through drainage ditches where he hid whenever he heard vehicles approaching. By nightfall he had covered miles. For 16 hours he moved carefully through the countryside, believing he might actually reach Allied lines. Then his luck ran out. At dawn, a German patrol discovered him hiding in a ditch beside a rural road. They dragged him out and beat him savagely with rifle stocks before throwing him back into captivity. From that moment on, his file carried a new label. Escape risk. Watch closely. Transfer east. And east was exactly where they sent him. Over the next several months, Beyrle was transported through a chain of prison camps across occupied Europe. Each new camp was farther from the front lines and deeper into territory controlled by Nazi Germany. Food became scarcer. Guards became harsher. The prisoners learned a simple truth about the German military prison system. The farther east you went, the worse things became. By autumn of 1944, Beyrle had already passed through multiple camps. But captivity had also taught him something important. Survival depended on adaptation. Inside the camps, cigarettes were more valuable than money. A single American cigarette could buy food, favors, or information from guards willing to bend the rules. Beyrle learned to trade. He learned to bribe. He learned to listen. And slowly he began planning another escape. The second attempt came in October. By that time he and 2 other prisoners had been assigned to a work detail near a railway yard. The plan was simple. Slip away during the work shift. Reach the rail yard. Climb into a freight car heading east toward Poland. If they could reach the Eastern Front, there was a chance Soviet forces might liberate them. Under cover of darkness, the 3 prisoners slipped away from the work group. Moving silently through shadows, they reached the rail yard and climbed into an empty freight car. Inside the cold metal box, they waited as the train finally lurched forward and began moving through the night. 4 hours they remained hidden, listening to the rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on track. They believed they were moving east, toward freedom. But somewhere during the night the train changed direction. Instead of heading toward Poland, it rolled directly into the heart of Nazi Germany. Berlin. At a switching station in the capital, railway workers opened the freight car. The discovery was immediate. 3 American prisoners hiding inside a train near Berlin. The authorities reached a simple conclusion. Within hours the Gestapo arrived. The Gestapo did not follow the rules of war. They did not recognize the protections of the Geneva Convention. To them, these men were enemy agents. The interrogations began immediately. Beyrle was stripped of his uniform and hung by his arms behind his back, a brutal torture method that forced his shoulders into unnatural positions until the joints partially dislocated. Guards beat him with whips and wooden clubs. They demanded information. They demanded names of American agents operating in Germany. They demanded confessions. But Beyrle had nothing to confess. He was not a spy. He was simply a captured soldier trying to escape. For 10 days the interrogations continued. Sleep deprivation. Starvation. Mock executions where guards pressed pistols against his head and pulled triggers on empty chambers. Still Beyrle refused to invent lies just to satisfy them. On the 10th day the Gestapo decided they had heard enough. They marched Beyrle and the 2 other prisoners outside into a courtyard. A firing squad assembled. Rifles were raised. The officer in charge announced that American spies would be executed for crimes against the Reich. The prisoners stood against the wall waiting for the order. Then something unexpected happened. A military vehicle pulled into the compound. Officers from the Wehrmacht stepped out carrying official paperwork. The German army had been tracking the prisoners from their original capture. According to their records, these men were legitimate prisoners of war captured during the Normandy invasion. That meant they fell under the jurisdiction of the army, not the Gestapo. A furious argument followed. For 3 hours the 2 sides debated. The Gestapo wanted executions. The army demanded custody of their prisoners. Finally, the decision was made. The army won. Joseph Beyrle was pulled away from the execution wall and returned to the German military prison system. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something else. Anger. 7 months had passed since the night he jumped into Normandy during D-Day. His family believed he was dead. The war continued without him, and he was still trapped behind barbed wire. In late December 1944, the Germans transferred him once again. This time the destination was a massive prisoner-of-war camp in occupied Poland. The camp was called Stalag 3C. More than 12,000 prisoners were held there. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across frozen ground surrounded by barbed wire fences, machine gun towers, and heavily armed guards. Winter had settled over the camp like a death sentence. Food rations were minimal. Many prisoners were sick or starving. But something unusual was happening beyond the camp walls. From the east, a distant sound echoed across the frozen fields. Artillery. The Red Army was advancing. The Eastern Front was collapsing for Germany. And in that chaos, Joseph Beyrle saw an opportunity. He began preparing his third escape. This time the plan was different. He would not run west toward Allied forces. He would run east, toward the sound of Soviet guns, toward the front lines, toward the war. Because after everything he had endured, Joseph Beyrle wanted only one thing: to fight again. Winter had turned the prison camp into a frozen wasteland. Inside the barbed wire perimeter of Stalag 3C, thousands of prisoners struggled to survive on thin soup and stale bread while icy winds swept across the open ground. But Joseph Beyrle barely noticed the cold anymore. For weeks he had been watching the guards carefully, studying their routines, counting their patrol routes, and listening. From somewhere far beyond the eastern horizon came a sound that filled every prisoner with cautious hope. Artillery. The guns of the advancing Red Army were getting closer every day. The German guards heard them too. And the closer those guns came, the more nervous the guards became. Beyrle understood something important. Nervous guards made mistakes. He began preparing his escape immediately. Cigarettes became his currency. Over several weeks he quietly traded and saved every cigarette he could get his hands on. Inside the collapsing German war economy, American cigarettes were more valuable than gold. Finally, the moment arrived in early January 1945. Soviet artillery thundered in the distance as explosions rolled across the frozen countryside. The guards spent most of their time staring east toward the approaching front. During a work detail outside the barracks, Beyrle approached one of the guards he had been quietly bribing. He slipped the man a small bundle of cigarettes. The guard looked away. For a few seconds, the fence line was unobserved. That was all Beyrle needed. He moved quickly toward a section of wire that had been weakened during the night. Dropping to the ground, he crawled through the gap and into the frozen darkness beyond the camp. Behind him, 12,000 prisoners remained trapped inside. But Joseph Beyrle was free. He did not stop running until the camp disappeared behind the trees. The plan was simple. Move east. Follow the sound of the Soviet artillery. Find the front lines. It was a desperate plan. If German patrols caught him, they would shoot him on sight. If Soviet soldiers found him first, they might also shoot him before realizing he was an American. But staying in the camp meant certain death if the Germans decided to evacuate or execute the prisoners as the front collapsed. For the next 2 weeks, Beyrle moved through occupied Poland in the middle of winter. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Snow covered the fields and forests. He had no map, no compass, almost no food. During the day, he hid inside abandoned barns and empty farmhouses. At night, he walked east, guided only by the distant thunder of artillery. German units streamed west along the roads, retreating from the advancing Soviet army. Beyrle avoided them whenever possible. But each day his strength weakened. The torture he had suffered months earlier during interrogation by the Gestapo had left permanent injuries. His shoulders still ached from being dislocated. Several ribs had never healed properly. Now starvation and exhaustion pushed his body close to collapse. Yet he kept moving, because somewhere ahead of him the war was still being fought. And he intended to join it. One morning in mid-January he reached the edge of a small village. Smoke drifted across the snow-covered rooftops. As he cautiously approached the road, he heard a deep metallic rumble. Engines. Then he saw them. A column of tanks moving slowly through the village streets. Their hulls were painted white for winter camouflage. And on their turrets were large red stars. They were T-34 tanks. The spearhead of the Soviet advance. For a moment Beyrle simply stared. After 7 months of captivity and 2 weeks of escape across frozen countryside, he had finally reached the front lines. But approaching Soviet soldiers carried its own danger. In a war zone, an unknown man walking toward a tank column could easily be mistaken for a spy. Beyrle raised his hands slowly above his head. In one hand he held the only proof he had of who he was. A pack of American cigarettes. Lucky strike. He walked toward the tanks slowly, shouting the only Russian words he knew. The Soviet soldiers reacted instantly. Rifles were raised. Men surrounded him, shouting questions he could not understand. For several tense minutes Beyrle stood in the middle of the road while armed soldiers argued about what to do with him. Finally a political officer arrived who spoke a small amount of English. Beyrle explained quickly. American paratrooper. Prisoner of war. Escaped from German camp. Wanted to fight. The officer shook his head. Regulations required escaped Allied prisoners to be evacuated to the rear and returned through diplomatic channels. Beyrle refused. He had not survived 7 months of torture and imprisonment only to sit safely behind the lines. He wanted to fight. The argument attracted attention. Soon the battalion commander arrived. She stepped down from one of the tanks and walked toward the small group of soldiers surrounding the American. Her name was Alexandra Samasenko. At just 23 years old, she was one of the most respected tank officers in the Soviet army. She had fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the war. She had lost family members during the German invasion. And she understood exactly what kind of anger could drive a man to keep fighting after everything else had been taken from him. After listening to Beyrle's story, she made a decision. The American would stay. He would fight with her battalion. Within hours Beyrle was issued a Soviet uniform and a PPSH-41. He was assigned to ride alongside one of the tanks as infantry support. The tank itself carried an unusual design. It was not Soviet-built. It was an American M4 Sherman, supplied to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. The situation was almost unbelievable. An American paratrooper who had been declared dead months earlier was now riding on an American tank inside a Soviet army battalion advancing toward Germany. No soldier in history had ever fought the war in quite this way. And Joseph Beyrle was not finished yet. Because somewhere behind them, the prison camp he had escaped still held thousands of Allied prisoners. And the Soviet advance was heading straight toward it. The war on the Eastern Front was unlike anything Joseph Beyrle had seen before. Only months earlier he had jumped into Normandy during D-Day with the 101st Airborne Division. There had been rules there. Prisoners were taken. Civilians were sometimes spared. But here in Eastern Europe the war had become something darker. Entire villages burned. Fields were littered with destroyed tanks and frozen bodies. The war between Germany and the Soviet Union had already killed tens of millions. Now Joseph Beyrle was fighting inside that storm. Riding beside Soviet armor, he advanced westward with the battalion commanded by Alexandra Samasenko. The soldiers around him spoke little English. Beyrle spoke almost no Russian. Yet somehow they understood each other perfectly when the shooting began. Within days he proved he could fight. His demolition training from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment made him valuable. Soviet engineers showed him their explosives. He showed them American techniques for destroying bunkers and bridges. War created its own language. Soon the Soviet soldiers began calling him something simple. Our American. At night the battalion rested inside ruined farmhouses or abandoned villages. They shared what little food they had. Black bread, buckwheat porridge, and strong vodka that burned like fire. Around those small fires the soldiers talked about home. About families lost during the German invasion. About the long road to Berlin that still lay ahead. Beyrle told them about Michigan. About the family that believed he had died in France months earlier. The soldiers laughed at the strange idea. To them, death was everywhere. A man who was still breathing was already lucky. By late January 1945, the battalion had advanced nearly 100 kilometers. German resistance was collapsing. Many enemy units surrendered rather than face Soviet tanks. Others fought desperately, knowing what awaited them in Soviet captivity. Then reconnaissance reports arrived. A large German installation stood directly ahead of the advancing battalion. A prisoner of war camp. More than 12,000 Allied prisoners were still trapped behind barbed wire. The name of the camp was Stalag 3C. Joseph Beyrle froze when he heard the name. It was the same camp he had escaped just weeks earlier. Now he was returning to it. But this time he was not a prisoner. He was coming back with tanks. At dawn on January 29th, the assault began. Artillery thundered across the frozen fields. Soviet tanks advanced from 3 directions while machine guns raked the guard towers. The German garrison was weak and unprepared. Most of the experienced soldiers had already retreated west. Within 2 hours, the defenses collapsed. Barbed wire was crushed beneath tank tracks. Guard towers burned. Thousands of prisoners poured out of the barracks in disbelief. They stared at the Soviet soldiers. They stared at the tanks. And some of them stared at the American wearing a Soviet uniform and carrying a PPSH-41. Several prisoners recognized him instantly. Joseph Beyrle, the man who had escaped weeks earlier. The Germans had told them he was dead. Now he had returned leading the army that liberated them. For many prisoners it felt like seeing a ghost. But there was little time for celebration. The war was still moving west. The battalion received orders to continue the advance toward Germany. Beyrle climbed back onto the rear of a tank and the column rolled forward again. Only days later, disaster struck. On February 3rd, the battalion was crossing open ground when the air raid sirens began to scream. German aircraft appeared above the clouds. 6 Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers plunged toward the Soviet tanks. Their terrifying sirens echoed across the battlefield. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Soldiers scattered for cover. Beyrle had just stepped away from his tank when the first bomb exploded nearby. The blast hurled him across the frozen ground. Shrapnel tore through his legs and back. A second explosion slammed into the earth only meters away. The concussion wave knocked him unconscious. When Soviet medics finally reached him, they believed he would die before morning. His left leg was shattered. Metal fragments had penetrated his back and abdomen. He was evacuated to a military hospital far behind the front lines. The doctors worked constantly. Surgery after surgery removed shrapnel and repaired broken bones. Against all expectations, Joseph Beyrle survived. His survival soon attracted attention. Word spread through the hospital about the American soldier who had escaped German captivity and fought alongside the Red Army. Eventually, the story reached the highest levels of Soviet command. One day, a visitor arrived at the hospital. The most powerful military commander in the Soviet Union, Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov had commanded some of the greatest battles of the war. He had defended Moscow. He had crushed German forces at Kursk. Now he was leading the final Soviet offensive toward Berlin. Standing beside Beyrole's hospital bed, Zhukov listened as an interpreter translated the American story. The parachute jump into Normandy. The capture. The torture by the Gestapo. The escape across frozen Poland. The battles with Soviet tanks. When the story ended, Zhukov remained silent for several moments. Finally he spoke. He said he had never heard a story quite like this one. Then he asked Beyrle a simple question. "What do you want now?" The answer was immediate. He wanted to go home. His family believed he had died months earlier. They deserved to know the truth. Zhukov solved the problem with a single signature. He ordered official documents prepared identifying Joseph Beyrle as an American soldier under Soviet protection. Travel permits were issued. A military convoy transported him east toward Moscow. Weeks later, Beyrle arrived at the gates of the American embassy. Wearing a Soviet uniform, carrying documents signed by Marshal Zhukov, and claiming to be a paratrooper who had already been declared dead. At first, the embassy guards did not believe him, but fingerprint records confirmed the truth. The man standing before them was indeed Joseph Beyrle, the soldier who had died in Normandy and come back. In April 1945, he finally returned to the United States. 2 weeks later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Joseph Beyrle lived the rest of his life quietly. He married, raised a family, worked a normal job far from battlefields. But history eventually caught up with him. Decades later, he received honors from both nations he had fought for, the United States and the Soviet Union. To this day, he remains the only American soldier known to have fought in combat with both armies during World War II. A paratrooper who survived capture, torture, and one of the most dangerous battlefronts in history. Not through luck alone, but through stubborn determination to keep fighting, no matter the cost.